For those of you who don't know me, I'm Professor of Modern Jewish History at University College London, and I'm also the director of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, which many of you will know was established in memory of the late British historian about 5 years ago. And I should say, as I always forget to do, that I am no relation of Sir Martin. The surnames are a coincidence. So many of you will know, of course, that Sir Martin was the official biographer of Sir Winston Churchill and also published very widely on a range of topics, 20th century topics, and also about the modern Jewish experience. Our aim here at the centre that bears his name is to bring the best historical research to a broad and non-academic public and make history accessible and exciting to that audience. In addition to public programs of the kind that you're attending today, we also work increasingly with secondary school teachers and students to provide lessons and resources drawing on primary source materials and the latest historical scholarship. So if you have any secondary school teachers in your orbit who might be interested in us, please do direct them to our work, which is always free at the point of access. And on the point of being free at the point of access, we are, of course, a tiny charity, and we really rely on your donations so that we can keep all of our events free and reach as wide an audience as possible. So any contributions that you wish to make are always very, very gratefully received, and it's very easy to donate on our website. So after that brief preamble, I'm really, really pleased to be able to welcome today, or to welcome back, Adam Mendelsohn, who is the director of the Kaplan Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Cape Town, and is also associate professor and head of the Department of History at that university. He's a distinguished historian of the modern Jewish experience, particularly in the English-speaking world, and he's published very widely on this subject. And he's also interested in ethnic and religious minorities, in addition to the Jews in South Africa. Adam's newest book is Jewish Soldiers in the Civil War, the Union Army. That was just published last year by New York University Press. And this book is, of course, what he'll be talking to us about today. And in the book, he's really interested in the everyday experiences of Jewish soldiers in the American Civil War, as his book title suggests. And I suspect he will be telling us more about some of the extraordinary archival material that he had access to when he was writing the book. So Adam will speak for about 40 minutes, and after that, we'll open the floor up for your questions and comments. Please feel free to post those in the chat, either to everyone or just to me personally, and I will put those questions to Adam. So without further ado, let me hand over to Adam, whose talk is titled, "What Was It Like to Be a Jewish Soldier in the American Civil War?"
Thank you very much, Shirley, and lovely to speak to you all this evening from Cape Town. And as Shirley's described, this is my focus this evening will be the Union Army. I'm at work at the moment on a book about the Confederate Army, and I'm very happy to discuss that with you if you're interested during the question time as well, to talk about some of the ways in which the experience of Jews in the Confederacy in the South was different from the Union. So I'm going to start by describing a really unusual and extraordinary episode during the war, more than 2.5 years into the war, an episode which happened in August of 1863. And in August of 1863, Benjamin Zold was the rabbi of Oheb Shalom congregation in the city of Baltimore, in the Union, in the North. Benjamin Zold was a young man. He was barely 30, and it was just finding his footing in America. Like most Jews in the United States at the time, Zold was a new arrival. He'd recently immigrated from Hungary. He'd arrived in the United States in 1859, so just 2 years before the Civil War began. Now he had an almost 3-year-old American-born daughter at home, Henrietta, the first of his 8 daughters. And Henrietta Zold would ultimately far surpass her father in fame, and she was the founder of Hadassah, the Zionist women's organization. But that was far, far in the future in August of 1863. For the moment, Rabbi Benjamin Zold had more keeping him up at night than just his infant daughter. Baltimore, after all, was a restive city in a restive border state in the midst of the Civil War. When the war broke out in April of 1861, a pro-Confederate mob had attacked Union troops as they passed through Baltimore on their way to defend Washington, D.C. They had pelted the troops with rocks and attacked them with clubs and knives as they crossed the city from one railway depot to another. You can see this, in fact, in the next slide. And we know, in fact, of at least a handful of Jews amongst the rioters at the beginning of the war in Baltimore, in other words, in favor of the Confederacy as opposed to the Union. Rabbi David Einhorn, who was a rabbinic colleague of Zold's, was chased from Baltimore on that same day in April of 1861 for expressing his opposition to slavery. In fact, spent the rest of the war in exile in Philadelphia. Didn't feel safe returning to Baltimore. Union troops, in effect, actually occupied Baltimore during the war, even though it was in the Union itself, to ensure that future troubles were suppressed. And these troops kept the peace within the city, but did not change the hearts and minds of many of the pro-Confederate residents of Baltimore. And though Baltimore was actually home to one of the largest Jewish communities in the United States at the time, about 5,000 Jews lived in Baltimore in 1861, we know of only 15 Jews from the city who volunteered for the Union Army. Again, you can get a sense of where the sentiments of the Jewish community lay. Rabbi Benjamin Zold may have had this on his mind in August of 1863, so 2 years after the start of the war, when he received an urgent request to travel to Beverly Ford on the Rappahannock River. You can see Benjamin Zold as a slightly older man in the next slide. The request had come from the headquarters of the 2nd Brigade of the 1st Division of the Army of the Potomac. This vast Union army had recently returned from Northern Virginia, depleted after a very difficult summer of campaigning that had begun inauspiciously with crushing defeat at the Battle of Chancellorsville and ended with the pursuit of General Robert E. Lee's army after success at the Battle of Gettysburg. So it's an exhausted army after a long summer of campaigning. So serious was the duty that so serious was his duty that the Orthodox Rabbi Zold traveled southward by train on Saturday after receiving this letter, breaking the Sabbath. He arrived at the camp shortly before noon and was soon cloistered with a man by the name of George Kuhn, or at least we believe was named George Kuhn. George Kuhn had begun the month of August 1863 under more hopeful circumstances in Philadelphia. There he had enlisted as a substitute in the 118th Pennsylvania Regiment, one of many, many regiments raised over that summer. Many of those who signed up for this particular regiment had little intention of fulfilling their enlistment contracts. Indeed, when the new recruits straggled into the sweltering camp close to the Rappahannock on August 6th, the escort had lost 50 of the recruits to desertion. This is only weeks after they had enlisted. 5 of their number were unlucky enough to be caught and were dragged into camp a week later, amongst them George Kuhn. Caught in civilian clothing, Kuhn denied that he had deserted. Instead, he claimed rather doubtfully that at his court-martial that he had gone to fetch water, some water, and had got lost. How exactly then he wound up in civilian clothing is less clear. The judges at his trial were unconvinced, and they ordered that Kuhn and his four others charged his trial to be executed, which is a very rare sentence at the time. Their desperate appeals for clemency, sent both to General Meade, who was the commanding general of the army, and to President Abraham Lincoln, were ill-timed. And we see their petition for clemency in the next slide. General Meade worried that that desertion was hollowing out an army already depleted over the previous 4 months by battle at Chancellorsville and Gettysburg. And he wished to stiffen the spines of the conscripts and substitutes who were filling the ranks in increasing numbers, to send a warning to anyone who was less committed to the cause, anyone who might think of deserting. So in other words, this was an exemplary case. They were trying to make a spectacle out of this execution. Lincoln was disinclined to undercut a general who had demonstrated the rare gift of besting General Lee in battle. What Meade did, though, was to concede to delay the execution so that a Catholic priest and a rabbi could attend to the prisoners. Hence, Rabbi Zold's forlorn and urgent travel to meet with George Kuhn. Kuhn, manacled and distressed, had been confined to a tent under guard for 2 weeks by this point in time. Their conversation, which either took place in German or Hungarian, that both were from Hungary, was punctuated by the steady tramp, tramp, tramp of tens of thousands of boots. At 3 o'clock, Kuhn and Zold stepped outside, and you see the scene which awaited them in the next slide. Below them were 3 divisions of the 5th Corps, at least 15,000 men standing in oppressive silence, arrayed in dense columns that formed 3 sides of a square. At their center were 5 freshly dug graves. The spectacle that followed was seared into the memories of many who witnessed it. Executions were still relatively rare in August 1863, and this one had been marshaled to serve an exemplary purpose, as I've already described. 2 artists from popular magazines had been invited to witness the event, and in fact, we see here their illustrations. The only sound, slow, measured, and sorrowful, was the Dead March by Handel, played by the Army Headquarters Band. One of the witnesses there that day, Captain Francis Donaldson of the 118th Pennsylvania Regiment, confided beforehand in his words that the thought of this bloody execution sickens me. They will be shot like dogs. And he described the events in great detail. I'm going to read to you some of the words he left behind in his diary. These are his words. Then came 2 coffins borne by 8 men, then 2 of the condemned with the rabbi representing the oldest faith on the right. Then another coffin with 4 men and 1 prisoner, and then 2 more coffins borne by 8 men, 2 more prisoners, priest and chaplain. Each prisoner's hands were manacled behind him. 4 of the condemned walked steadily and with apparent unconcern. 1 was weak and tottering, and with difficulty borne along, needing heavy support. So the processional arrives at the graves. The prisoners were seated on their coffins, and the firing party was halted and stood at parade rest. And this is where Donaldson continues. He writes, "My God, think of the terrible thoughts of these helpless men as they marched to their graves. Think of their awful condition as seated on their coffins. They gazed at the 12 men standing before them, sternly awaiting order to take their lives. Oh, it was a dreadful sight to see them there, swaying backwards and forwards, so utterly helpless and forlorn. Our regiment was posted close up to the graves, a little to the right of them, close enough to hear the earnest words and prayers of men of God who prayed so fervently that God would have mercy on their souls." He continues that a much agitated Kuhn now stood up and recited after the rabbi a portion of Tehillim, Yigdal, and Shema. At the close, the rabbi, much affected, kissed the accused, who convulsively clung to him. And again, Donaldson continued. After a few parting words, the ministers of the gospel stood aside, and the poor fellows were left alone on the brink of eternity. They hadn't long to wait. "Attention, guard," in clear ringing tones called Captain Orne. "Shoulder arms, forward march," and the solid, steady tramp of the details sounded appalling on the ear. When within 6 paces, "Halt," ordered the captain. "Ready, aim, fire." And 60 pieces flashed in the breast of the deserters, and military justice was satisfied. 4 of the men fell heavily back on their coffins and rolled off to the ground, their heads striking the coffin lid, making a sounding thud, while the bullets passed through the bodies were seen skipping and bounding over the open fields. The scene horrified Rabbi Benjamin Zold. Moments before, he had embraced Kuhn. Now the friendless soldier was confined to an unmarked grave. The poor rabbi, the Donaldson, our witness, continued, was sadly cut up. He had never before witnessed such a death scene. Hastening to the major's tent, he gathered up his few traps and made for the train, anxious and eager to get away from such scenes of blood, as he expressed it. He was in such a hurry to depart that he left his pocketbook behind. It was no coincidence that the next month, Rabbi Zold arranged for the Jewish soldiers stationed around Baltimore to be issued with passes so that they could attend high holy day services in the city. This, in fact, was one of the only cases we know of where rabbis actively intervened in this way to provide passes. We can presume that Zold still had Kuhn on his mind. In reality, this tragic episode involved one of the few instances where the Union Army made a special allowance for Jews. Indeed, there was great novelty in so many Jews having so freely chosen to serve and fight for their homeland. This is new in Jewish history. We know of at least several thousand Jews who volunteered for the Union Army. Never before had Jews joined a mass volunteer army, it's itself a relatively new historical phenomenon, in such numbers and with such enthusiasm. Their precise number is unclear, though the Chappelle Manuscript Foundation has been working for years to produce an accurate roster of those who did serve. As we will hear this evening, it was difficult to be a Jew in the Union Army, more so than it was to be a devout Christian. The Army's reputation for hard drinking, hard swearing, and hard living was long established even before the war. Few were under any illusion that the mass volunteer armies provided a haven for the faithful. Devout Christians routinely complained that the army camp was a profane place, and you see some of the vices of the time in the next slide. Few of their fellow soldiers shared their desire for religious fellowship. Coarseness and boorishness reigned, idle hours were filled with sinful pursuits, like playing cards, and officers and men were indifferent to Sabbath observance. Those who prayed in public faced scorn and scoffing. The conspicuous display of piety was associated with women and with domesticity, not with manly vigor of soldiers. If faithful Christians feared the mockery of their comrades, Jews had even more reason for reticence. This, of course, did not stop some from trying to live like Jews in the army. Henry Auerbach, for example, who mustered into the 13th Ohio Cavalry in April of 1864 as a farrier, was eager to worship as a Jew. We know that, for example, in July of 1864, when he and his comrades were encamped behind the entrenchments that surrounded the city of Petersburg in Virginia, during the siege of Petersburg, he called a meeting of Jewish soldiers at the regimental headquarters. In fact, he wrote a letter to the newspaper describing this, very proudly describing how he, farrier Henry M. Auerbach, presided. Auerbach was tasked at this meeting with writing to Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, the famous leader of the Reform movement in America, to solicit a Seder, tzitzit, and tefillin, prayer books, ritual fringes, and phylacteries, as well as copies of Wise's newspaper. For, and these are Auerbach's words, "We are tired of reading the Evangelist," the missionary newspaper. They wanted Jewish reading as opposed to Christian reading. Ideally, Auerbach proposed such articles, religious articles, should be provided to each and every Jewish soldier in the Union Army. And the letter demonstrates his desire to maintain some measure of religious observance in the field, as well as his confidence in donning garments certain to call attention to his religious identity. In other words, there's no sense of shame or fear in putting on tefillin, etc., in the field. With his regiment temporarily becalmed, again during the siege of Petersburg, his request reveals how he is mapping out a future for himself that included time for orderly prayer with him and his fellow Jewish soldiers. What happened next, however, reveals how war could intrude on the best laid plans. Because just 2 days after he sent this letter, his regiment went into line, occupying rifle pits and bomb proofs roughly 200 feet from their Confederate counterparts. And you can see some of the fortifications around Petersburg in the next slide. The barrage of bullets and shells a soldier in the regiment recalled was now constant. At night, it sounded like old-fashioned wood chopping, this constant battering of bullets and shells. A whiskey ration was issued twice a day. After 2 weeks in shelters and trenches, the kind you see in the slide, the regiment was moved even further forward, even closer to the Confederate trenches. And here they entered this new stage of misery, where it was torrential rain which filled their trenches and swept away their fortifications. One soldier in the regiment remembered that the ground was, in his words, alive with vermin. Maggots washed down from the hillsides, and our hardtack contained the little chaps. Put a hardtack in hot coffee, and these little scamps will crawl out with a smile on their faces, as if to say, "Howdy do." Our appearance, wrote the same soldier, grey backs, ragged cloths, unkempt hair, etc. So really this picture of misery. The regiment was launched forward as part of a broader assault on July 30th that accompanied the battle of the crater, this disastrous battle during the siege of Petersburg. The regiment was torn to shreds as it attempted to storm the Confederate breastworks. And bodies of friends and comrades lay for the next 3 days in the sun, recognizable only after these 3 days by their cavalry jackets when they were finally collected and buried under a flag of truce. So understandably, after returning to the rear after this terrible battle, more than 20 men in one company rebelled, refusing to take up arms anymore and pleading to return to cavalry duty. Auerbach was fortunately spared some of the exhausting routine that followed over the next months: picket duty, skirmishes, constant digging of trenches, felling trees, building breastworks, as he was diagnosed with an abdominal complaint that had clearly been exacerbated by the stresses of combat. And eventually, only now months later, was the regiment returned to cavalry duty and Auerbach returned to his horses. There's no evidence, however, that he was ever sent his prayer books, nor that he received his newspapers. As Auerbach's plea to Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise reveals, Jewish soldiers largely had to fend for themselves in the field. Access to the well springs of Jewish life was limited. They were far away from any Jewish center. For the most part, the Union Army marched and fought in areas where relatively few Jews lived prior to the war, and most Jewish soldiers were very far from home. Despite these and other challenges, Auerbach and some of his fellow Jewish soldiers sought to fashion space for themselves with an environment more accommodating of the profane than of the sacred. Much of what we know about the role of religion for Jewish soldiers is revealed in the everyday choices that they made relating to Jewish dietary law, to kashrut, the Sabbath, and religious festivals and prayer. In fact, military life rewarded flexibility and a willingness to be flexible. August Bondy, who was a Jewish immigrant from Austria, was already used to eating pork before he enlisted. And we know this because he describes in his memoir how before he enlisted, he slaughtered his hogs and then joined the regiment. He wanted to make sure that his wife and young daughter had food for the winter. But he nonetheless, despite the fact that he was raising pigs and felt no qualms about making pork part of his regular diet before the war, he nonetheless complained about the monotonous diet of salt pork, about bacon and beef that were the staples of army rations. And you can see this, in fact, in the next image, a very unusual wartime cartoon. This is a cartoon sent to an illustrated newspaper by what's described as a Hebrew recruit. Again, a cartoon without explanation, but clearly a Jewish soldier remarking on the fact that their diet was heavy, very heavy on pork. August Bondy was frequently hungry in the field because of the inadequacy of supplies, and he relished the foraged additions that he and his messmates added to the pot whenever they could. When times were tough, his contributions included hunting raccoon. Likewise, Marcus Spiegel, also an immigrant, made little fuss of the meat that he ate, though he took careful note of the occasion when his drab diet was supplemented through the industry of his men. He was an officer. In his words, on one occasion, he wrote, "My boys killed 3 hogs during the night." And he wrote to his wife, "And they gave me a couple of nice hams, which with other things made us a splendid repast." Similarly, another soldier, Nathan Mayer, had similar fond memories of in his words, fine, good-sized pig that his colored orderly had stolen or confiscated, in his words, and then boiled after the battle or South Mountain. He reported that, in his words, he fared well on it for 2 days. Joseph C. Levy, who was a Orthodox soldier, regarded his daily pork ration as taking his trefa lumps for Uncle Sam. Camp life, he complained when he wrote to an Orthodox Jewish newspaper in New York in 1862, involved, in his words, a bill of fare that included, in his words, bread, coffee, pork for breakfast, coffee, pork and bread for dinner, and pork, bread, and coffee for tea. Perhaps as a good Orthodox, he wrote, the less I say on the subject, the better. Joseph Levy held his nose in the mess tent and resigned himself to an unholy diet. While I did not discourage others from following his example by enlisting, Levy's letter reminded readers of this New York Orthodox newspaper that army life required many compromises and much flexibility on the part of Orthodox Jews. Immigrants who comprised the bulk of Jewish volunteers may have already been accustomed, in many cases, to making do. And certainly we know this from the case of a young soldier from Germany, a 16-year-old soldier by the name of David Zeddon, who, in his words, relished the good food and drink he received in the army. "Our best food," he wrote to his family in Berlin, "is thick rice with syrup and a piece of bacon." In fact, what's interesting here is that this is in spite of indications that Zeddon continued to put on tefillin regularly while in the army. In fact, he continued to put on tefillin until his tefillin was stolen. He left them in his bread sack, and his bread sack was stolen after he'd been in the Union uniform for 10 months. I'm sure they were stolen not for the tefillin, but for the bread. Zeddon's perspective about food and his willingness to relish eating bacon, for example, may have been shaped by his own experiences before he enlisted. He actually arrived in the first month of the war in New York. He arrives in May of 1861, and his timing was terrible. New York is in the midst of economic depression, and he was unable to find work. And he wrote to his parents these very poignant letters to his parents about, and I'll quote them to you, how hunger is painful. It takes an awful lot of a young person who's supposed to feed himself all alone. He'd spent a number of months sleeping on park benches and really struggling to find food before he enlisted in the army, hence the fact that the regular supply of food, even if it is bacon and syrup and rice, is very attractive to him, despite the fact that he's clearly religious. Such compromises born of the press of circumstances would be familiar to others seeking to make their way in the New World, that the young men who'd immigrated to America in the years prior to the Civil War are used to, perhaps in many cases, to being forced to adapt, to be flexible, even prior to enlisting in the army. Though the consumption of pork was a particular taboo for tradition-minded Jews, the fresh and salt beef supplied to soldiers did not conform to rigorous religious standards either. You get a sense of what the rations looked like in the next slide. In reality, it was well nigh impossible for an enlisted man to permanently forego his meat ration and subsist on coffee, hardtack beans, and the plunder of forages, even if supplemented by generous food parcels dispatched by family and friends on the home front, really care packages which are regularly sent to soldiers in the field. The arrival of these occasional packages from home did more to bridge the psychic and physical distance that separated men from their loved ones than provide a reliable source of sustenance. But nonetheless, the men pined for these comforting tastes of home. So, for example, Marcus Spiegel wrote to his wife, and I'll quote him at length, "You may send me something nice to eat in the box. It will not cost any more to send a bottle of something to drink." 2 weeks later, he wrote, in anticipation of the arrival of his box, "My mouth is watering for the contents already. I have no doubt, but it will be here by tomorrow. And then, oh God, won't I pitch in? I should think I will." And then he writes to his wife after he receives the box, that in his delight at what she had sent, and he writes, "Tongues were just the thing on a hard march." So it's clearly she'd sent to him pickled tongues, and this is a pickled duck tongue. This is particularly delightful to him far from home. It was not much easier for soldiers to observe religious rituals. The regimented rhythms of military life granted men relatively little autonomy. When in camp, an endless cycle of drill and parade structured time and allowed for little variation in routine. Few allowances were made for the Christian Sabbath, never mind the Jewish Sabbath. While officers had more freedom than enlisted men, the vagaries of military movements and the lumbering nature of the military bureaucracy, which was stingy with leave, made it difficult to plan ahead with any great degree of certainty. So, for example, Marcus Spiegel, the man who loved the duck tongue sent from home, learned only serendipitously from a chance encounter with a fellow Jewish soldier in September of 1862 that Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur were a few weeks away. And he was unable to, in fact, attend a synagogue. He was on leave, because instead he received a pass that he could go home. These fellow Jewish soldier, in fact, did go to synagogue that same year for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and left us an account of his experience. He wrote back to his parents, and this is his letter. He said he was pleased to find a large congregation engaged in prayer when he arrived on the first evening of Rosh Hashanah. This is in a occupied town. "Oh," he said, "it made me feel as though I were home among friends once more." But yet he described a mixed reception in the synagogue. By his reckoning, in his words, all the Yehudim in Norfolk, Virginia, are embittered against the northern soldiers, and he had some little arguments with some of them. He found most of them pretty reasonable, excepting the young ladies. They, he said, can out-argue the smartest statesmen in the world, according to their own way. Marcus Spiegel, our duck-tongue-loving soldier, found another way to engage with Jews he encountered in the towns that his regiment passed through. For example, early in an exhausting campaign in the Shenandoah Valley in 1862, before his regiment was marched off his feet in this famous losing campaign against Stonewall Jackson, he described how, in his words, he had lots of fun with Yehudim, with Jews. He would recognize Jewish civilians, in his words, by the name as well as the ponim, by their face, and he would surprise them by dropping Hebrew into his conversation. And he said to his wife, "You ought to see them jump and ask, Yehuda, Jew?" Spiegel repeated this trick in Memphis, and you see Memphis in the next slide, temporarily leaving his men aboard. And this, in fact, is the Norfolk synagogue here. Next slide is Memphis. This is the synagogue that that our Jewish soldier attended. So in Memphis, Marcus Spiegel left his men aboard a transport ship that would soon take them southwards towards Vicksburg, and he encountered a Jewish couple as he strolled along the riverbank. And remembering that it was a Saturday, the Sabbath, he itched for a chance, in his words, to have a kosher lunch. And he greeted them with, what he wrote to his wife, with "Happy Sabbath, dear people." This frightened the gentleman and probably his wife, who were unused to being offered happy Sabbath, in his words, by a man in uniform with sword, spurs, and so forth. He was directed by the Jewish couple to a Jewish boarding house where he joined 30 other very surprised Jews for lunch. And the tables were soon turned. This is a classic Jewish scene where his host, in fact, recognized his face and established their family interconnections. And this is Jewish geography, 1862 style. And this chance meeting actually paid dividends for Marcus Spiegel. A month later, he was camped 3 miles above Vicksburg, and he received a sumptuous, what he describes, a box full of things from these same well-wishers in Memphis. And such opportunities were relatively few and far between. The next time we know that he observed the Sabbath, he celebrated the Sabbath, was more than a year later. He was now in Baton Rouge, where he was invited to the house of a Mrs. Bear, a local Southern Jewish woman, who regularly entertained Union officers. And he was very critical of the Shabbat meal he has with her. He wrote, "Her place would seem very pleasant to go to if it were not for 6 as mean children as I ever saw." And he complains about her hospitality as well. We actually only have very few accounts of Jewish soldiers celebrating festivals while in the field. The best known account is that left by Joseph A. Joel, actually an Englishman, who moved to America again very soon, shortly before the war, and then enlisted as a young man, left a vivid description of celebrating Passover, Pesach, in 1862, while in the village of Fayette in West Virginia, in a remote location in West Virginia. He told of the approach of Passover. He was told of the approach of Passover, presumably in letters from home, and he and what he claimed were 20 of his comrades and co-religionists belonging to a particular regiment were granted relief from their regular duties. They could prepare to celebrate Passover. They entrusted the regimental sutler, the regimental merchant, with some of their newly paid wages, and they asked him, he was returning to Cincinnati, to send them matzah once he returned home. And this matzah arrived shortly before Pesach, 7 barrels of matzah, 2 prayer books, and they apparently arrived with hours to spare before Pesach was to begin. And this is Joel's account, which I'll read to you. In fact, see it in the next slide as well. "We were now able to keep the Seder nights, if we could only obtain the other requisites for the occasion. We held a consultation and decided to send parties to forage in the country. Our party stayed to build a log hut for the services. About the middle of the afternoon, the foragers arrived, having been quite successful. We obtained 2 kegs of cider, a lamb, several chickens, and some eggs. Horseradish or parsley we could not obtain, but in lieu we found a weed whose bitterness, I apprehend, exceeded anything our forefathers enjoyed. We were still in a great quandary. We were like the man who drew the elephant in the lottery. We had the lamb, but did not know what part was to be represented at the table. But Yankee ingenuity prevailed, and it was decided to cook the whole and put it at the table. Then we could dine off it and be sure we had the right part. The necessaries for the charoset we could not obtain, so we got a brick, which, rather hard to digest, reminded us by looking at it what purpose it was intended. So now with their symbolic foods in place, sacramental wine, at least a standard, a lamb shank, with this instance an entire lamb, an egg, a bit of herbs, and a charoset, the paste of nuts and fruits representing the mortar and brick of Laban Egyptian bondage, they were ready for their Seder. And Joel led the service. The ritualized meal, which began with this somber exhortation for divine intervention, preserve our lives from danger, soon devolved into farce. And you see this in the next slide, and I'll read you more of Joel's account. The ceremonies were passing off very nicely until we arrived at the part where the bitter herb was to be taken. We had all had a portion of the herb ready to eat at the moment I said the blessing. Each ate his portion, when horrors, what a scene ensued in our little congregation. It's impossible for my pen to describe. The herb was very bitter and very fiery, like cayenne pepper, and excited our thirst to such a degree that we forgot the law authorizing us to drink only 4 cups. And the consequence was we drank up all the cider. Those that drank the more freely became excited, and one thought he was Moses, another Aaron, and one had the audacity to call himself Pharaoh. The consequence was a skirmish, with nobody hurt. Only Moses, Aaron, and Pharaoh had to be carried to the camp and there left in the arms of Morpheus. This slight incident did not take away our appetite, and after doing justice to our lamb, chicken, and eggs, resumed the second portion of the service without anything occurring worthy of note. There he continued in the wild woods of West Virginia, away from home and friends. We consecrated and offered up to the ever-loving God of Israel our prayers and sacrifices. I doubt whether the spirits of our forefathers, had they been looking down on us, standing there with our arms by our side, ready for an attack, faithful to our God and our cause, would have imagined themselves among mortals and acting this commemoration of the scene that transpired in Egypt. Equally endearing, but even less reliable, is the Passover tale of Moses Levy, a cavalryman in the 5th Pennsylvania Regiment. Levy is remembered to have come across the unlikely sight of a young boy munching on matzah upon entering a town in northern Virginia in April of 1864. He remembered that, in his words, when he asked the boy for a piece of the unleavened bread, the child fled indoors, shouting at the top of his voice, "Mother, there's a damn Yankee Jew outside and he wants my matzah." The boy's mother, we are told, displayed more grace than his son. She came out immediately and invited him to return for a Passover supper that evening. To conclude and to return to the subject with which we started, the less fortunate religious ritual that bothered Jewish soldiers related to burial. You'll see this in the next slide, the urgency of having to think about burial. Dying far from home and alone was an abiding fear for soldiers, as was concern about what would become of their remains. For Jews, it also raised the problem of internment in unconsecrated ground and without Jewish burial rites. When called upon, local rabbis conducted funerals for soldiers who died in military hospitals. But more often, Jewish soldiers had to hope that other Jews would step in to help. In Nashville, for example, we know that Henry Spitz formed a personal bond with Prussian-born Julius Littmann, whose regiment was encamped opposite his house for more than 3 months in the fall of 1862. Littmann, the Jewish soldier, accompanied Spitz to synagogue on Yom Kippur, and Spitz was in frequent contact with him and other Jewish soldiers in the regiment. The relationship, unfortunately, had a tragic end. Littmann's regiment was engaged at the Battle of Stones River, 30 miles from Nashville. And Spitz recalled, in his words, that at the first opportunity I had after the battle, I inquired after him and heard he had fell on the battlefield. I considered it my duty, if possible, to recover the body, to give him a burial according to the laws of Israel. Spitz sent word to Pauline Littmann, the soldier's wife, Chicago, asking for instruction, in his words, how to dispose of the remains of a lamented husband. He's unable to locate the wife, and with the intermediaries in Chicago not encouraging him to dispatch the body northwards, instead, Spitz proceeded with the burial. First, I found the body and then ensured that it was properly buried. And this is his description. He says that on the 9th day after his death, I found him a plain coffin at the undertaker's. His features were the same as living, smiling in death. With the assistance of friends, we claimed the remains, had them brought to my house, and then interred the next day, Friday the 9th of January, on the burial ground of our congregation, with all the honors a Yehuda wishes for. Spitz that wrote this account and published it in the newspaper, now hoping that Pauline Littmann, the widow he could not find, would have some record, would learn the facts, in his words, of all that had happened to her husband and have some consolation from knowing at least that his remains were taken care of. For those who survived the war, the experience of soldiering was transformative. The war broadened their social and geographic horizons and socialized them to life in America. Yet the Civil War was truly transformative, not just for those who fought in the Union Army, but also for all Jews in America. On the one hand, it was a root cause of the emergence of modern anti-Semitism in the United States. So it really starts a very negative trend in American Jewish life. On the other hand, it's also responsible for an extraordinary transformation of the economic position of Jews. These, however, are topics for another time and for other talks. Thank you very much. So I'm very happy to take some. I see questions in the chat. I can.
Thank you, Adam, very much for a really stimulating and fascinating talk. I'm going to start off with one of my own questions. Since I've been running the slides, I haven't been able to see the questions that have come through. So in order to buy myself a little time, I wonder if I can ask you a question. And I was really struck by your comment right towards the beginning of your talk that this moment is the first real moment where we see Jews turning out in great numbers to enlist for any military. And of course, we know that later in the 19th century, and certainly by the First World War, this is a pattern that we see a lot in Europe as Jews, kind of newly emancipated, see the military particularly as a way to demonstrate their patriotism and their loyalty. And I wondered how much of this you see playing out in the United States. I mean, it's obviously a very different context because it's a civil war, but whether some of the patterns you see of the later emphasis on an interest in Jewish military participation, whether that colors at all this early moment of Jewish interest and participation in the military.
So it's a very good question. And we see in truth a somewhat mixed picture. In my book, I've obviously described to you religious experience, but also I deal in detail with exactly this question. What are the enlistment patterns? What is the extent of enthusiasm? Why did Jews enlist in the army? Or why did they choose not to enlist? And some do clearly enlist out of for ideological reasons, that the belief in the preservation of the Union, abolitionism. So August Bondy, who I referenced during the talk, is a fervent abolitionist. He's in fact involved in the failed liberal revolutions of 1848 in Europe, and as a very young man, as a 14-year-old, then comes to America, becomes involved with John Brown in Bleeding, Kansas, and then enlists in the Civil War. So there certainly are these ideological soldiers who are deeply committed to freedom, or to the United States, the principles of the United States. They're probably a minority amongst those who enlist. There are many of these, a point I made very briefly in my talk, many of these, the vast majority of Jews in America, and likewise those who enlist, are recent immigrants to the United States. Most of them, they're coming from Central Europe. And in some cases, they're coming from Central Europe to evade military service there, or certainly most of them are economic migrants, in truth, seeking economic opportunity and the freedoms that America provides during this time. So some of them do bring with them liberal principles and commitment to republicanism, etc. I think that the vast majority are enlisting for other reasons, and I make this argument in the book that the economic benefits of enlistment are substantial and are persuasive, not just to Jewish soldiers, but to many others, particularly in the early stages of the war. I mentioned again briefly in my talk that there's an economic crisis in America precipitated by the war that precedes the war. The succession precedes the war, and that creates chaos within the American economy. Many of these are young immigrants who are in marginal occupations to begin with. They're peddlers and hawkers, they're small shopkeepers, and they are driven towards military service by economic need. That's a reliable paycheck. There are what are called stay laws, which if you have a business, you cannot have liquidation proceedings against your business if you enlist, a whole variety of things of this kind. But that does not preclude patriotism either. So we have these very interesting cases. Again, Marcus Spiegel, who I spoke to, who I described, he's the pickled tongue man. He's someone who undoubtedly, he writes it openly in his letters to his wife. He starts the war as someone who enlists because he needs financial security. It's bad timing. He's just opened a warehouse in a town in Ohio prior to the war. He's invested heavily in this, and he will go bankrupt unless he enlists. And he looks for, in his words, he describes as a bomb-proof job. And then he discovers quite quickly that he really likes soldiering and he's quite good at it, and ultimately rises to command a regiment. Very rare case of a Jew becoming a colonel. And we see a shift in his thinking, that likewise he begins the war deeply hostile towards abolitionism. He's revolted by the idea of a war against slavery, and he ends the war as an ardent abolitionist. He ends the war, unfortunately. He's killed during the war, but late in the war. But this interesting shift of mindset. So, and this is typical of both Jewish soldiers and others as well, that they sometimes begin for more instrumental reasons for economic need, and then they become committed to the cause as the war wears on. But we do see what is unusual here is this mass volunteering, that for all these reasons and other reasons that Jews are choosing to enlist, and those who do enlist typically follow the pattern of Marcus Spiegel, and they become committed, very committed to the cause after experiencing all the trials of soldiering.
Really interesting. So on this question of commitment to causes, one question was asking whether there is something in Jewish doctrine or in Jewish thinking that would allow Jews to fight to defend slavery, or conversely give their lives for the cause of abolitionism. I suppose asking if there's a Jewish root for either of these positions.
So it's a great question. Again, one of the things that my book does is to demonstrate that, unfortunately, prior to the war, those Jews who support abolitionism are in a very small minority in the North. And there are a variety of reasons for this. They are, for the most part, Jews are drawn to the Democratic Party, very different Democratic Party in 1860 than today. It's a party of immigrants, but it's a party which is for a variety of reasons very weary of abolitionism. And so Jews come to share that thinking. There's a fear amongst immigrants that the emancipation of slaves will redound to the detriment of immigrants in particular. But Jews have particular reasons to be concerned about abolitionists and abolitionism, in that the leading lights within the abolitionist movement are often evangelical Christians who are also involved in missionary movements targeting Jews. And this creates sort of a real sense of threat, awkwardness, and otherwise with abolitionism amongst Jews. So we have an extraordinary moment just prior to the war in January of 1861, where the American president, this is prior to Lincoln taking office, President Buchanan calls for a day of prayer. Very ineffectual president. He hopes to head off secession by holding a day of prayer, and across the United States. And the most famous rabbi in America at that time, in fact, a rabbi that served in Birmingham before he came to New York, Morris Raphael, delivers a sermon in New York to the most prestigious Ashkenazi synagogue in the city, with an enormous audience sitting there, which is a sermon in defense of slavery in New York City, effectively saying that slavery is biblically sanctioned, and that, yes, Southern slaveholding is in contravention of the Bible, and in other words, that slaveholders should not be so cruel to their slaves, but that slavery is biblically sanctioned. And it's then reprinted in the South over the next number of months as a demonstration, justification of a rabbi who's is imagined at the time to have special access to the word of the Bible, etc., has endorsed slavery. And the fact that this takes place and doesn't create certainly there's pushback against it by some others, a number of other Jews who say, wait a second, this reading of the Bible ignores Talmudic interpretation, etc. But this reflects broad opinion amongst Jews, and I think amongst many other immigrants at the time as well. So certainly awkwardness about abolitionism, but not necessarily support of slavery. I mean, I think that's, for example, many Jews will enlist to defend the Union, and then change their thinking ultimately during the war. They come to understand that this needs to be a war against slavery. I can again talk about the Confederate side of the story as well, but in the Union, it's not. This is a very different picture than you might imagine in terms of Jewish sentiment about the major political course of the day.
Mm. Well, there were a few questions about the Confederacy, so maybe I'll jump to those. And I promise, Roger, we'll get to your question, which was the first one to get in there. So we'll definitely come back to it. But there are a couple of questions asking just generally about Jews who fought for the Confederacy, and someone speculating that there were more Jewish people living in the South at the time of the Civil War, so proportionally there were probably more Jews fighting for the South. Maybe you can say a little bit more about that.
Good, it's a good question. So you're right to one extent, or at least what I'm likely to argue. I'm still trying to gather evidence on this. But probably more Jews fight for the Confederacy than for the Union. But this is not because there are more Jews in the Confederacy, but because of probably conscription laws in the Confederacy. It's very difficult to evade service in the Confederacy. That ultimately, most men, white men between the ages of 17 and 45, are hoovered up into military service during the war. For the most part, in the Union, it's a volunteer army. But in truth, there are only 25,000 Jews in the Confederacy and about 125,000 in the Union. So many, many more Jews living in the Union than in the Confederacy. Within the Confederacy, there's at least what I'm finding is that there's a very variegated experience, differentiated experience between those who are recent immigrants, who in some cases, yes, become ardent Confederate patriots, but again are some of them enlist, some of them are obliged to enlist, but their commitment to the war is more limited. That they see the writing on the wall. In many cases, they try to get out of the Confederacy when they can. They aren't necessarily willing to die for the Confederate cause. Some are, but most aren't. There's that experience amongst immigrants. And then there are Jews who are deeply committed to the Confederate cause, who tend to be of much older Southern Jewish families. Many of them are Sephardi families in Charleston and Savannah and elsewhere who've been there for generations by this point in time. They've grown up in the South. They share the values of the surrounding society. They tend to be slaveholders. They've really imbibed the values of the broader society, and they again tend to serve out through the war. They're in some cases very prominent within the Confederacy as well. That we see Jews rising to much higher ranks within the Confederate Army than in the Union Army, and also Jews sitting in Confederate government. That most famously Judith P Benjamin, who starts the war as Confederate Attorney General, then becomes Secretary of War for a time and spends the longest period during the war as Secretary of State, which is perhaps the most important office in the cabinet, in that the Confederacy's entire strategy for winning the war is to effectively persuade European governments to recognize the Confederacy and to enter the war on its side. So it's a very important office. And he's not alone. For a time, the Quartermaster General of the Confederacy is Jewish, and a variety of others are Jewish. And we don't see that pattern in the North, in the Union. And so it's again a distinctive experience of the Confederacy.
Interesting. There was some discussion about Judith P. Benjamin in the chat too. But as promised, I'm going to go back to Roger's initial question, which is, are there any branches of the Jewish faith which espouse pacifism and refuse to engage in warfare?
It's a good question. So certainly we see lots of Jews in the Union who evade military service or choose not to enlist rather than evade military service. As I said, it's for the most part, it's actually a volunteer army. And if you are conscripted, it's not so difficult to evade conscription either. But my sense is that it's less for religious reasons. I haven't come across cases of people claiming religious exemption. Instead, it's a reluctance to enlist because of the costs of service, that if many Jews at this point are shopkeepers or businessmen, and to leave they're immigrants, and to leave your business behind means that the business undoubtedly, very likely would fail. You'd have to start again after the war. You're an immigrant. Again, you've taken tremendous risk crossing the Atlantic. You might see this not as your fight, or at least a fight that you might support, but you might not choose to put your body on the line, etc. So all sorts of other reasons to not serve, as opposed to religious reasons. And in fact, there are. During the war, we see, for the most part, in the Union, rabbis do not preach in favor of enlistment or of military service. Again, many of them are actually very diffident about the war. This is in the Union itself, and a lot of them keep quiet or quite critical of the Union. In the Confederacy, we see the opposite. We see a number of prominent rabbis who write and recite prayers for the Confederacy, and again encourage their congregations to enlist. A different pattern on the home front in both places. And again, the reluctance of rabbis in the Union is not because of pacifism, it's because of their own political views. In the Confederacy, we see this pattern of encouraging service because of their political views.
So I'm going to ask one penultimate question, and I have a nice question to close with, but I just want to apologize in advance to those whose questions we're not getting to, and they're still continuing to come in, also to me in the chat, so apologies in advance. This question was, so you had mentioned that the period after the Civil War sees the beginnings of increased anti-Semitism in the United States. Can you say a little bit more about why that was?
So this is one of the novel arguments of the book, in that previously the scholarship on American anti-Semitism really dates the beginnings of modern American anti-Semitism later to the late 1870s into the 1880s, really tied to mass Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe to the United States. And instead, what I see evidence of during the Civil War is a trialing and an emergence of themes which will then come to dominate in the 1870s and 1880s. That very, very early on in the war, again, as with any war, any war, which particularly a civil war, it generates, particularly on the home front, particularly on the Union home front, where the war does not go well for long periods of time, generates a casting around for scapegoats, a hysteria, agitation, all sorts of fear during the war, angst during the war, and again, as is not uncommon in such circumstances, this angst finds particular targets. And Jews are targeted very, very early on in the war, and around particular scandals. And this requires a little bit of explanation, the backstory here, which is that the United States Army prior to the war is 15,000 strong. It's a tiny professional army prior to the war. It's the Union Army alone by the end of the war will enlist more than 2 million men. So it's an army which grows from really nothing, small professional army, this enormous mass volunteer army in a very, very short space of time. What that means is that in the early months of the war, there is this rush not only to enlist men into service, but also to supply them with everything that they need to fight. They need uniforms, they need rifles, they need tents, etc., etc. And there aren't yet systems to do this in a coordinated, systematic way. So there's a tremendous amount of corruption during the early months of the war. And likewise, there are scandals around this, and the press really delights in this. There's much, again, agitation in the press about the way in which the government is being fleeced by unscrupulous contractors. There's reports, for example, of soldiers who march off into the field, and there are rainstorms, their uniforms melt away in the rain. So there's naked soldiers left in the field. So the press kind of makes hay with such things, but much agitation around this. Jews are amongst the earliest contractors, and some of them become quite considerable contractors to the Union Army. They are a minority. In fact, some of the larger contractors are well-known names today. So, Brooks Brothers, the clothing firm, is an enormous supplier to the Union Army, crooked as anything. So they supply substandard uniforms. Brooks Brothers started by Scottish brothers, no Jews involved. But the attention, again, as happens sometimes in such cases, focuses on Jews. And there is a series of scandals, particularly in the summer, the first summer of the war, and known as the shoddy scandals. Shoddy is actually a technical term to describe wool which has been recycled, which has been broken down, is used as insulation, typically for clothing or for jackets, etc. And what a number of companies do, including Brooks Brothers, is use shoddy, to use this material to make clothing, to make uniforms for soldiers, which is, again, they predict the war's not going to last long. Who cares? We'll make money, and it doesn't really matter. These shoddy uniforms will collapse. Again, these are the cases of soldiers left naked in the field. And so the shoddy changes its meaning. It becomes this term as we know it today, sort of substandard goods. And shoddy and Jews and contractors are terms which are then become used interchangeably. So there's a surge of anti-Semitism around particularly this, that Jews are the vultures, they're the parasites, they're the corruptors in the early months of the war. And that theme will certainly last through the war. And this idea that Jews prefer profit to patriotism will last after the war as well. And a number of episodes during the war, which again revive these ideas. And I argue that this creates really the foundations then for what will come later, that in the 1870s, no accident that there's a wave of social exclusion from Jews, including Joseph Seligman from an elite, the wealthy Jewish banker who supplied the Union Army during the war with clothing, etc. That he's excluded from a prestigious hotel in upstate New York. And it's no accident that it's him. And it's no accident, again, that there's a revival of this idea that Jews can never be faithful, proper citizens. This, again, I argue, comes from the Civil War. So this is the seedbed for what will come later. This and a variety of other themes which emerged during wartime.
That's a really important intervention. So the final question, which I promised, was a nice closing question from Gladwin, who asks, why does a Cape Town historian research something like this?
It's a very good question. I should also say that there's one other question which I've seen, which is a more esoteric one about Max Ross Valley. And I'm sitting here with my desk with this tiny little card of Max Ross Valley that I've had it for years, and it sits here right in front of me. This is a really unusual figure. I'll be very happy to talk more with the person who asked about this figure. It's a very unusual individual during the war. But your question, I have yet to come up with a really good answer to the question about how do I land up with this topic. in truth, and despite sitting in Cape Town, my expertise as primarily American Jewish history, and I grew up with a great interest in the South African War and the Anglo-Jewish War, so there perhaps there's a little bit of continuity there. And it's, and in some ways, it's actually happenstance that I once in graduate school, when I was doing my PhD, I innocently wrote a paper on the Civil War, and that became a different book about the Civil War, and I've maintained this interest ever since. So it's sort of some way accidental, but I think wartime is very revealing in all sorts of ways, because it does create intense social stresses. It does, again, force people to make a variety of choices, and I think it's a very fertile moment to think about how do Jews deal with this major American moment, which hasn't unfortunately been much explored by historians prior to my work on it.
Mm. Well, thank you. First, I should say, Alan, that if you'd like to be in touch with Adam, then please do just email me at the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Center, and I can put you in touch with Adam. I'm also amused to hear, Adam, my PhD and first book were also the result of a chance essay written while in graduate school. So maybe this is how things happen.
Be careful what you write on, in other words.
Exactly. Thank you so much again on behalf of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Center for taking the time to talk to our audience. It's been really fascinating and such an important intervention in the field. And I do encourage you all once again to take a look at Adam's book. And let me just remind you of our next talk, which is going to be next week, Thursday, the 18th of May. And that's by Elliot Clark, talking about a very different subject, and that is Clementine Churchill's role as an advisor to Winston Churchill. So please do join us for that and check out all of our other talks. We look forward to seeing you all at some point again soon. Thank you so much again, Adam.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
Bye-bye.